Welcome to the Regeneration Collective podcast, the next UN Visions for a Regenerative Future. I'm Silke from Brockhausen, a UN insider with 18 years across more than a dozen UN missions, from Sierra Leone to Vanuatu to Yemen to Afghanistan, and the founder of the Regeneration Collective. As the UN approaches its 80th year and the campaign for the next Secretary General gets underway, amid protracted conflicts, widening inequalities, and cross-planetary boundaries, we ask, how can the UN become the platform through which people, institutions, and the more than human world repair and transform broken systems and create conditions where life can thrive? In each episode, we speak with regenerative practitioners, policy shapers, indigenous knowledge holders, peace builders, culture makers, and frontline humanitarians about the lived experiences and visions that could translate into regenerative UN policies, organizational culture, and operations. This is for UN staff, partners, member states, and bridge builders who are curious about what regeneration means in practice and who are ready to turn the UN into a trailblazer for this shift. And today I'm joined by Rukmini Iyer, a leadership developer, peace builder, and dialogue facilitator working at the convergence of inner development, organizational transformation, and peace building. Founder of Exalt Solutions and a facilitator with the Work That Reconnects by Joanna Macy, Rukmini designs trauma-informed, decolonial, and ecocentric spaces from boardrooms to conflict zones. She serves on international boards, is a Global Peace Index ambassador, and brings 2 decades of cross-continent practice to conscious regenerative leadership. Welcome, Rukmini, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
I met you as part of a 3-part web series on decolonizing inner developments, and I was in awe at the way how you guided us participants online towards deep self-reflection and depth of ideas. And I wanted to have a longer conversation with you, and I'm using this podcast to talk with you more. I would like to share that I deeply resonate with your mission to build peace through more conscious leadership of ourselves and others. So my first question for you is, how would you explain regeneration simply and practically for our audience to understand?
Thank you for that. There's so much written and spoken about regeneration, and I think we've somehow made it more complex than it needs to be. To me, regeneration is simply about actively participating in and contributing to life that we come from. So that would mean not only doing things that will sustain the systems as they are, but also help to propagate more life and therefore have practices and have behaviors that are generative of life and not draining or extractive in nature.
Why would you say this is especially important at this moment of times of crossing planetary boundaries, conflict, inequality?
You named it. Because of those very reasons, we are crossing planetary boundaries. There's so much conflict. There's so much systemic injustice that needs to be named and addressed and worked upon. And it is also important to recognize that a lot of it has to do with human choices and human behavior. So it is specifically to do with how we have been acting with each other. But a lot of it is also coming from the kind of relationship we have built with the planet and how we have been very extractive in the way we relate to all other species that we inhabit this planet with, and also what we tend to call resources, which are, again, I mean, to me, I would think of them as planetary beings, our forests and our rivers and everything else. And we certainly need to heal those relationships and repair them for us to really start building peace.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think this is also a beautiful definition of where we are right now as human species and also what is needed to heal. But where would you start? What is the starting point to shift the current state that you have described?
There's work to be done at really every level of our being. I think that the primary starting point always would be my own self in terms
Mhm.
of how do I, as a being on this planet, living in this moment in time, what is my role towards life? And what can I do to ensure that life sustains and grows and generates in a manner that is coexisting with all other forms of life, because we truly have enough. I don't think there are lack of resources. It's really a matter of figuring out certain beliefs we've instituted in ourselves around the idea of ownership, around the idea of limiting access to resources. And those are things that, of course, need to change at a systemic level. But the starting point for me would always be the self, because that's something that
Mm.
everyone has access to. And ultimately, what grounds systemic change is personal change.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's the big foundation that we often ignore when we want to solve the problems in the world. We are actually contributing to them with our own mindset and perspectives that might still be rooted in this more extractive, exploitative mindset that we've all been conditioned under growing up in this world. I'm really interested also in the term decolonizing, which has come up a lot in regenerative discussions. Maybe you can explain what this means and how this fits into also the inner development aspects that you talked about.
I'm not an academic, so I'm not going to speak about decolonization from an academic perspective. The way I tend to relate to the idea of colonization is the tendency and the decision to extract from what is not yours. And we've seen very many forms of it across human history. We've seen it in the form of territorial colonization by European colonizers around the world. And the at the heart of that form of colonization was extraction of natural resources, extraction of people as resources, extraction of elements of culture and artifacts and so on. So yes, that's one form of colonization which tends to get spoken about a lot, but I don't think it's limited to a certain race engaging in political colonization or territorial colonization. It's also something that all of us tend to engage in when we attempt to extract from anything in life. We're extracting oil from, for fossil fuel. We are, the whole idea of agriculture in some ways is really a form of colonizing land, right? And saying that
Mhm.
I will not allow for this piece of land to grow what naturally grows, but I will force it to grow what I want it to grow. So, in many ways, the history of humanity is the history of colonization. And it's a deep tendency which exists in all of us, regardless of race or the kind of body we're born with. And at the same time, I also very firmly believe we have the capacity and the will to overcome this tendency. It is perhaps a tendency that comes from survival instinct, that I want to ensure my own survival, and therefore I look for fixed sources that will enable my life.
Mhm.
And that's okay. That need for survival is okay. What is essential is that we strategize differently around those needs and look at what are ways in which there can be a fair exchange of what we need for all of us to survive. For me, a lot of the work around decolonization is really about dialoguing through this. How do we survive and thrive together?
I think, yeah, what you alluded to is a lot of the fear-based mentality that we have and a tribal mindset of I take care of myself, my own family first, and ignoring that we are all connected and we need each other and that there's enough to share. And if we all work together, that we can actually have a thriving planet and environment. I also really like the aspect of trust, which is one of the key components. And going towards an organizational perspective, you've worked with a lot of organizations around peace building, bringing these mindset shifts into organizations. How is it possible to do that? Where can we start in an organization, let's say like the UN, to start, first of all, creating a demand that this work is necessary, that we need to look at where we personally are still fear-based, not trusting, maybe replicating extractive mindset? And how can we then, when the demand is created in an organization, go ahead and work on changing this mindset?
I think in many ways, the larger institutions that drive our world and represent our collective needs are also mirrors of our collective consciousness, right? So if the UN is acting or performing in a certain way, it is because that's where our collective consciousness is. So it's not about blaming an institution, but looking at what are ways in which we can slowly and steadily start shifting it in a manner that works for all of us. So for me, for something like UN as a living system, what we would certainly need to work on is looking at what sort of diversity of voices shape policy. Because at this point, there is, I mean, while there is always a defense around that saying we are consultative by nature, who has access to those consultations? And what about societies which do not think in the language and the mindset of frameworks and policies and so on? How do we bring in those voices as well? So, yeah, the diversity of voices would be one thing I would start working towards in UN or any other institution for that matter. Also, looking at capacity for reflection, because there's so much of the languaging around the work that's done through UN or any other funding agency, which is about outputs and it's about time and it's about very short term deliverables, which completely distance ourselves from the subtler realities of life and of culture uh, of peoples on the planet. So, yeah, how do we learn to reflect both individually and systemically is something I would definitely look at. And in the process, of course, the relationality is definitely something that comes into play. What is the health of relationships? The health of relationships between the UN and the spaces that it works in, between the field and the HQ, right? All kinds of relationships within the system.
These are beautiful points, and I know from working with the system for 18 years that these policies or this way of operating, it's part of the awareness of colleagues that it's important, and everybody understands that we need to include voices, that we need to build good relationships, and also do reflections, which in the UN is usually an assessment and evaluation, very metric based, very data facts, and not so many stories. But also there, I see a little bit of a shift. I think there are not many colleagues who see it as one of the priorities of foundation. They see it more as an add-on if we have time to do it, because they understand how important it is. In my view, what is really needed is to first give colleagues the opportunity to embody it themselves within the organization. So the organization itself becomes a place where everybody is listened to, where all the voices are heard, where it's diverse voices. It becomes a place where relationships are safe and trusted and important, and there's time for relationship building within the organization. And then also an encouragement for feedback loops in the system, in the organization, as this part of reflection you were talking about. If you were a leader in the UN, what were the steps to encourage your team, your environment, your organization to maybe embody these or to live them.
I agree with what you say, Silke, in that I think our work in the world is our work within ourselves. So if
Mhm.
UN has a certain kind of work in the world, then it also has that same work to do within itself. And that is, to me, the process of capacity building, doing that work within yourself in a manner that you're able to ripple it out to the world. So if we are looking for the UN as a system to be able to embrace, go beyond dominant narratives and embrace other forms of reporting, other forms of evaluation. And, we're so caught in some of these terminologies, right? And it may be very important to find alternatives to what does it mean if we don't evaluate in the conventional sense, but look at other ways in which the work is making impact. So,
Mhm.
yeah, for these questions to be asked out in the system, each individual within the system also needs to do this work within themselves. So for me, it would mean a lot of effort and energy invested in the capacity for people within the UN systems to be grounded, to be empathetic, to be able to hold paradox, because we are a world in transition, and there will therefore be a lot of paradoxes and a lot of ambiguity. And it's important that we don't kill questions with answers, but really learn to gestate questions in a way that responses will generate from them when the time is right. And of course, this capacity building within individuals will eventually also reflect in terms of behaviors around how people can be more collaborative than competitive, start thinking
Mhm.
more long term and intergenerational rather than short term, and looking at just the reporting timelines. And of course, in terms of policy, I think we have UN or otherwise, we have a lot of work to do in terms of embedding ecological limits and cultural wisdom and justice into every policy conversation.
Those are beautiful ideas. And I do feel from what I've experienced in this very hierarchic and bureaucratic system that it is not easy to instill this kind of thinking. And it needs also demand from staff to understand why it's important, and also support from the leaders at the top. But in case of the UN, I feel also you need member states driving this agenda, looking at making the UN inside more regenerative and like unlocking its potential. For me, this is what it's about. It will create this opportunity if you build trust in a system and if you manage to break down silos and hierarchies, what we talk a lot about in the UN. And I think regenerative tools can help with this. Then you really create a space for allowing failures, taking risks, and innovation, ideas, and people who might not be listened to come up with solutions. And I feel this could really transform the whole organization from inside. I'm very passionate about this kind of approach and mindset. And I know in teams where I've seen this happening, that magic was possible with this UN that has reached to 193 countries, has incredible talents everywhere, and also access to governments and to resources to really create this kind of more ecological ecosystem thinking that doesn't extract and exploit. So, long story short, I know that you're working with specific tools also in organizations to support this kind of transformation. One is power mapping for trust, and then a conflict compass, the work that reconnects, of course. Can you tell us a little bit more about these tools, just so our audience can get an idea what this could look like in a practical setting?
And let me start with the work that reconnects. It is a body of work started by Joanna Macy, which has had a huge influence on how I am beyond how I work. So, yeah, that's something that I would recommend to really anybody and everybody who wants to do this work. It's relevant no matter who you are and what you do. because it's literally, as the word suggests, it is about working on oneself, on other things that you do in a manner that reconnects, in a manner that helps us remember that we are part of this larger web of life and we are very much dependent on this larger web of life for us to be able to survive. And therefore, how do we learn to repair this relationship with humility, with curiosity, and of course in a manner that is nurturing and not letting us get stuck in guilt tripping and shame and so on. So and that's certainly not the tone of the work that reconnects. So that's something I would wholeheartedly recommend to really anybody, person, institution, ecosystems, whatever they are. Some of the other things you named are tools that have emerged over a period of time while working in different contexts. You spoke about power mapping. That's something that I've been using over the years, largely to look at understanding levels of trust and alignment when you're working, particularly in a multi-stakeholder environment, looking at where does one need to build more relationships, do a little more tending of things that need healing and need alignment? Because sometimes there may be relationships which are really critical in the context of, let's say, a project or some work that's being done. And at the same time, it's not fueled by trust, but sometimes it's just fueled by contracts and more transactional things. And that's not really sustainable. And it is critical in such cases that we learn to name the lack of trust that emerges for various reasons. Sometimes it could be reasons to do with intergenerational trauma, it could be to do with cultural reasons, it could be really any reason. And to gently start naming and acknowledging the existing level of trust and what that does to power equations and dynamics within the relationship, and then slowly and actively start working towards building that trust. So, yeah, that's a tool that's emerged over a period of time, and I've been adapting it and using it in different contexts. I think you also mentioned the conflict compass, which again, through some pieces of work. And that's a tool I've been using to support teams to help situate themselves, particularly in moments of conflict, and to start naming what are we avoiding, what are we polarizing, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and where does the capacity to collaborate exist? How can we start working towards collective needs and strategize in a manner that meeting one need will not in any way discount another need? And so looking at how do we create constructive movement even as conflicts exist. So yeah, those are some tools that have emerged over time.
It sounds like it could be both of them, or also the work that reconnects would be so useful, not just internally for changing the organizational culture in the UN, but also externally when we work with communities on the ground to create more impactful, meaningful engagements and programs in the end. And maybe one question I'm asking all of my podcast guests is, imagine that you are going to be the next Secretary General on the 1st of January 2027. You'll be the CEO of the organization. It's an administrative function, but you can guide internally how the UN system works together, the 30 plus agencies, institutions, departments, the 130,000 staff on the ground in 193 countries. You can steer the organizational culture and processes and policies. And also you have influence on member states on at least the topics that are discussed. So to achieve a more connected way the UN is operating, a more regenerative way, decolonized way, what would be some of your first agenda points?
It's a fascinating thought exercise. One thing I would certainly do is to place ecology at the center of peace and development, because peace with the earth is critical to peace amongst our own species. We cannot resolve our wars unless we learn to resolve our relationship with the planet and all her other beings. So I would definitely place ecology at the center of both peace and development work. I would also shift financing because funding is a huge part of the game at UN. I would look at how do we shift financing from extractive projects towards more regenerative economies, and how do we support communities to regenerate and recover from the trauma that they've had to undergo. And of course, very importantly, also lead a cultural transformation within the UN. How do we, as an institution that reflects and mirrors the need and the state of the world, how do we as an institution learn to model humility and accountability and courage?
Yeah. I hope you're going to run and start a plan campaign. I love also the courage part, your last word. I have seen that happening. Leaders that are courageous, that are purpose driven, intentional, that don't have their own personal agenda, that are free of all the fears of losing their job or creating conflict with their superiors or member states. I have seen them so powerful in the responses I've worked in on the ground. And I think that's something I really wish for more courage in the system to implement this change that we are talking about in yourself. And then it will create ripple effects automatically around us. And I've seen that also happening. So, coming to the end of our podcast, but I'm sure many of the listeners are now curious how to get in touch with you and maybe what your offerings are. If you want to tell us, and we'll put some links also in the show notes, obviously, to find you. But how could the UN work with you or UN staff?
So LinkedIn or my email is a great place to connect and start the conversation. And yeah, my work is a lot to do with peace building, leadership, organizational transformation, and I tend to look at it through the lenses of the work that reconnects and systems thinking, narrative practices, decolonization. So those are some of the themes that I tend to engage with. And yeah, a lot of the work in the recent years has also been looking at governance in institutions through all of these lenses and looking at how do we create organizations by instituting governance structures that are regenerative in nature, that are ecocentric in nature rather than being egocentric. So, yeah, that's the sort of work that I love to contribute to. So, happy to stay in touch.
Yeah, I really hope that this offer will be taken up by many of my colleagues. Very last question. Can you share with us maybe one daily practice you could recommend that helps us to reconnect, to ground, or decolonize our mind? Something easy to implement to get started on this journey of regeneration.
Yeah. Um, So, whenever I live in a concrete jungle in Mumbai, so it's not very easy to access a garden or some place that has a lot of trees and plants. But whenever I have that opportunity, one thing I tend to do is to create what I call nature mandalas, which are and that's something you'll find a lot on my social media. And it's really about picking up leaves that have fallen on the ground or flowers or twigs and stones and what have you, not plucking anything but really looking at things that are already fallen. And I use it as a contemplative practice as I walk to pick up some of these things. In the process, also notice my own judgment around it. And what I eventually do with what I've picked up is to create an artistic formation of it, but that just happens to be the end result of the process. But I think that the process of it is really crucial to me, in terms of if I pick up a certain leaf and I want to, if I tend to dispose of it saying, oh, it looks a little too withered, then it's a great opportunity to ask myself, what is my judgment around beauty? What is my definition of it? Can I learn to see the beauty in a leaf that is withered because it has fulfilled an entire life journey and now it's ready to go back into the soil? And can I learn to see that journey instead of trying to uphold my narrow definition of beauty? And you can really replace beauty with anything, right? Any principles that you abide by, whether it's justice or truth or goodness or whatever it is. How do I learn to see that in the world, and how do I learn to honor that? And in the process, creation of that nature mandala for me is that's really my prayer.
Mm.
So yeah, that's a practice that I find really nourishing.
That's such a beautiful way to connect with nature and contemplate at the same time and be creative. I think creativity is something that also helps us to get into a more regenerative mindset, and maybe also an exercise you can do in community and create
Absolutely.
something together, right? I can't wait to check it out on your social media. And I want to thank you so much for the time and wisdom you've shared. It was such a beautiful, deep, enlightening conversation. And I wish you all the best in the beautiful work you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and for the space. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.